The Olympus E-300 was released back in 2004. Now, at the time, this cost around $1,000. Nowadays, you can find it used for about $75. That's how much I paid for this one right here. So just what do you get with this 18-year-old camera? Well, there's an 8-megapixel 4/3 CCD sensor, an ISO range of 100 to 1600, and a 1.8-inch 134K LCD screen. Now, in terms of build quality, the E-300 is aluminum and plastic. It's not quite the same robust build that you would find on a modern professional camera, but it's definitely not as cheap as like a more entry-level camera. It's somewhere right in between. The styling of the E-300 is kind of what Jeremy Clarkson would call a Marmite car, meaning either you love it or you hate it. You know, you've got to remember the E-300 came from that time period when the look of DSLRs wasn't quite set in stone the way that it is nowadays. Back then, things were still just kind of open for interpretation, and with the E-300, it really shows. And it doesn't end there. See, the E-300 uses what's called an optical poro finder. What that means is, unlike regular DSLRs which use a pentaprism, which is just a fancy word for 5-sided mirror, the image basically bounces off the mirror and then up into the viewfinder. The E-300 uses a series of 4 mirrors working in conjunction with a sideways swinging mirror, meaning the image is actually bounced to the right and then up into the viewfinder, which is set off axis from the lens. I mean, seriously, who comes up with this stuff? In terms of autofocus on the E-300, you've got 3 autofocus points just right across the center of the frame. That was pretty common of like 90s era film cameras and even some early 2000s era digital cameras. Having said that, only having 3 autofocus points, I haven't really had any trouble with autofocus on this camera. Everything's been weirdly accurate. Storage media on the E-300 is compact flash. During the time that I've been filming this review, I've been shooting with an 8GB card, and I haven't had any trouble with that, so I can verify the E-300 will accept at least up to 8GB. And of course, it's worth noting for anyone who's new to photography, the E-300 is a 4/3 camera, not a micro 4/3 camera, meaning it only accepts 4/3 lenses. Now, one thing that might be kind of a bummer, and maybe even a problem for some people, is the lens selection. And it's not just a problem with the E-300, it's just 4/3 cameras in general. So you gotta remember, 4/3 cameras were only around for a really short period of time. You know, it was just a few years, and then Olympus and Panasonic said, hey, let's make micro 4/3. And then everything went that direction, and the rest is history. So 4/3 just kind of got put on a shelf, and weren't a whole lot of lenses made for this system. Don't get me wrong though, there are still a lot of good lenses out there, but just maybe not the selection that you would find with a lot of modern cameras, especially when it comes to fast primes. You know, you've got the Sigma 30mm f1.4, which is currently going for around $150. And then you've got the Panasonic Leica 25mm f1.4. It's the 4/3 version of the micro 4/3 one that you're familiar with. But that's currently selling for around $500 to $600. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, that kind of bums me out. Like, I like these cheap cameras to be cheap. You know, I want it to be like a $100 system or a $200 system. Once you're paying $600 just for a lens, now you're kind of creeping up into that Olympus EM1 Mark II territory or Canon M50 territory. You know, for me personally, 4/3 lenses aren't a deal breaker, but it's definitely worth pointing out. In terms of shutter speed, you've got up to 1/4000th of a second. And in terms of flash sync speed, you've got 1/180th of a second in normal mode, or all the way up to 1/4000th of a second in what Olympus was calling Super FP mode. For a camera that's 18 years old, that's pretty impressive. And in terms of burst rate, you've got up to 2.5 frames per second for a maximum of 4 frames. The menu system on the E-300 is old school Olympus. Having said that, I've never really had any trouble finding anything. The layout is pretty easy to navigate, and everything's kind of where you would expect it to be. Now, in terms of image quality, you've got that 8-megapixel Kodak CCD sensor, and that's where this camera really shines. You know, I've always been a fan of these old CCD sensors, but something about this Kodak sensor in particular just looks magical. Like, you know, in a world where people are just kind of obsessed with the look of film, I'd say this sensor is one of the ones that really comes closest to kind of reproducing that whole vibe. You know, in modern times, you have these sensors that are technically perfect. They're scientifically great at producing excellent dynamic range and incredible sharpness and resolution, but they kind of lack character. The Kodak CCD sensor in the E-300 just has so much character that you don't really find in a modern camera. So is the E-300 still worth it in 2022? And for me, that's a simple one. Yeah, 100%. You know, you've got all the obvious things like great build quality, great image quality, all at a really good price. But for me, it's the intangibles of this camera. You know, all the things that you won't find on a spec sheet, that's what wins me over with the E-300. All of that weird quirkiness, you know, let me explain it this way. Most of you guys watching this are probably sane, normal people. You probably have one, maybe two cameras at the most. But for someone like me who's a camera collector, you know, collecting cameras from all different companies, all different eras, for me, the E-300 is a camera that really stands out in the crowd. You know, when you collect cameras, the unfortunate downside is sometimes cameras do just kind of get stuck on the shelf and they just sit there day after day and they never get used. But the E-300 is one of those cameras that when you walk past the shelf of cameras, that camera just calls to you, man. That camera's just like, hey man, come on, let's go take some pictures. And you sort of think like, yeah, let's go take some pictures. You know, the E-300 just, every time I see that camera, I want to pick it up. I want to go out. I want to take pictures. You know, and not all cameras have that. Not all cameras have that kind of unspoken quality that you're not going to find on a spec sheet. Anyway, I think that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.